In this video, we're going to talk about a different way of thinking about how wars start from the rationalist approach we talked about last time. And this is what we call the steps to war approach. And there are some kind of vague references to this kind of idea in the textbook, but it really doesn't get explored in depth in the textbook. And so I want to take some time and to do it now. The steps to war approach, as the title implies, is simply that there are a series of steps that most of the time lead up to wars, and therefore if we can think about interrupting that chain, maybe we can prevent war, right? So the premise is war doesn't just happen. It starts with a dispute, and then there are a series of steps, right, that lead to war, and then of course lots of disputes never go down that full set of steps. And so the question is it possible to get more disagreements resolved without taking that final step where people start killing each other? One of the questions this approach looks at is what kinds of disputes are the ones that seem to put states on a potential path to war. And there's a bunch of research that shows that territorial disputes seem especially likely to lead to war. That probably shouldn't shock us. The problem is that while this literature finds that territorial disputes are probably the single biggest cause of war, there's lots and lots of wars that don't happen because of territorial disputes. And of course, there are a lot of territorial disputes that don't lead to war. A couple of the ones that lead to war, have led to war recently, are Ukraine and Russia, or Armenia and Azerbaijan. But there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of territorial disputes around the world, and most of them never lead to war. So one of the things to think about is what's the difference. The other thing is what other kinds of disagreements lead to war. Sometimes there's a fight over a form of government. Is it going to be autocratic or democratic? Sometimes about alliance patterns, sometimes about economic disagreements. So even at this very first step, right, identifying which sorts of disputes are likely to lead to war and which ones aren't, isn't necessarily very easy. But anyhow, these are the steps to war, and this comes from a whole bunch of research done by a guy named John Vasquez and his co-author in the particular article I'm referring to here. It's a guy named Paul Sinesi. So first you start with a dispute, as I've just been talking about. And the next thing that typically happens, they say, is a decision to handle the dispute in what they actually call realist terms. That is to say, you start threatening and you build up your military. So the first step to war, they're arguing, is the idea that the way to prevail in this dispute is to make motions towards the fact that this is something you might want to fight about. They also find that wars tend to not just pop out of nowhere. They tend to come from long-term disputes, what they call enduring rivalries. Countries that have had arguments with one another that recur over a long period of time. Moreover, they say that wars tend to happen when there are recurring crises. Not merely that the states are rivals, but before you actually get to war, there are probably at least a couple of other cases where you thought maybe war was possible, but you've stepped back from the brink. And then what seems to happen is there seems to be escalation from one crisis to the next. So instead of looking at the brink and then stepping back, crises come fast enough that you really just escalate from one to the next, and eventually the two sides just decide, well, we're going to go to war, we might as well get at it. So this is a sort of stylized sense of how states go to war. And the idea, of course, is that at each of these steps, decisions are made that if they were taken differently, might lead you in a different direction. And we could identify lots of historical cases where war is avoided at any one of these steps, right? You think about the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Cold War, right? That was a case that got all the way up to the step number 5 after the Berlin crises of the early 1960s and the Bay of Pigs and so on. They got right up to the point where if they had gone to war at that point, everybody would have said, yep, we saw that coming, but in fact they didn't. So one of the real questions is, how do you interrupt this sequence? The problem is, in using this and putting this knowledge to work, is that it's pretty clear that each of these steps increases the likelihood of war, but that none predicts it perfectly, in the sense that none of these is a necessary condition for war, meaning If this happens, then war happens. That would be easy to focus in on then. Nor is, sorry, I got that wrong. None of them is a necessary condition in the sense that without that condition, war can't possibly happen, right? If we could find those things that you can't have war without, we could really focus on them. Similarly, sufficient conditions. A sufficient condition is one that if this happens, war will happen. And again, if you could identify those, you could really focus in on trying to prevent them. Why is it so hard then, even if we identify these steps of war, to avoid them? The bigger picture I would point to is war almost never comes out of nowhere. We see it coming. Over a long period of time, it gets closer and closer and closer, so that when wars finally happen, we are almost never surprised. And the question is, well, if that's true, if you see it coming, why can't you avoid it? And that's really the point I make in the third bullet point here. Well, why don't we avoid it? Because in order to avoid it, we have to make a concession, right? That's the way we head off of the pathway to war and get onto the pathway to something else, as we say, okay, we'll give in on this, right? Or we'll give in on this if you give in on that. And almost always there's this feeling that we don't want to give in on that, right? We don't want to make that concession. And not only do we not want to make that concession, we don't think we should have to make that concession. We're in the right and they're in the wrong, so they should make the ones. They should be the ones to make the concession. Moreover, and this last point, point 6 is a really important one, is there's this notion that not only should we not make a concession because we are on the right, but we shouldn't make a concession because if we do, we'll encourage them to bully us even more, right? So there's actually good strategic reasons, maybe, if what you're dealing with is a bully, right, not to make concessions. But when both sides view the situation that way, both sides say, you know what, better to escalate than make a concession. So the real big point I want to get at, and you can see this in lots of different wars, is the things that you need to concede on, the concessions that need to be made, or the compromises that need to be made in order to avoid a war, sometimes are incredibly painful, right? We have to give up on getting that piece of territory that has our ethnic kinfolk in it and that we think historically actually belongs to us. That's a hard thing to do. We have to give up on the idea that this country is going to be our ally, whatever it is. It's easy to say make a concession. In practice, these things can be incredibly painful and, of course, very costly for leaders. So just to take one example of why this gets so difficult, then look at the lessons of World War II. So because in a way, the leaders in the 1930s tried to pay attention to this idea of the steps of war model, and even that didn't prevent war. So England and France and Czechoslovakia made major concessions to Germany in 1938. And essentially, they were doing what both the rationalist view and the steps to war model might advocate, which is basically they said, wow, Germany has gotten really powerful. It wants a big chunk of Czechoslovakia. Rather than fighting a war over it, let's just let them have the slice of Czechoslovakia they're asking for. We'll get to the same outcome, but without having to refight World War I. We'll have made the concession, right, that will avoid war. As it turns out, Germany strengthened its position because it now was able to expand into the east. And as we know, Germany ended up going to war anyhow. And so that episode has remained firmly in policymakers' minds ever since. This Munich analogy gets brought up again and again and again, and it actually argues against making concessions to satisfy the demands of other countries. So this is just an example about why countries oftentimes will say, maybe making concessions to avoid war isn't such a hot idea. And that perhaps helps us explain why we get to war even when we see it coming and we think it should be avoidable.